Hi, I'm Jim Wallace with the Kentucky Historical Society, here today with John Gray, Historic Frankfort, and we're going to talk a little bit about the historic African American churches of Frankfort. I don't think many people realize how important our churches have been to our community. Perhaps no other institution has played a greater role in Frankfort, Franklin County, African American life as the church. Numerous scholars, authors, teachers have all paid tribute to African Americans' religious institutions. And I just want to quote a couple of prominent Kentuckians and national authors that you'd recognize and what they have to say about the role of the African American church. Marion Lucas, who's the author of A History of Blacks in Kentucky, Volume 1, From Slavery to Segregation. He writes in his book, "Next to the family, churches were the most important institution in black society. By providing a link with the real world of oppression and racism and the spiritual world of fairness and equality, religion helped many blacks endure the travail of slavery. Ultimately, black churches became, in addition to religious sanctuaries, the nucleus around which blacks organized their social, educational, and cultural activities." George Wright, a very prominent African American historian, PhD from the University of Kentucky, wrote in a book that he put together entitled Life Behind a Veil, Blacks in Louisville, 1865 to 1930s. He states, "The churches were the leading institutions and were always more than just church. What is most important is their attempt to reach out to the community and to be of service. Indeed, over the years, the churches gave comfort and assistance to whoever came to their door." And the last author that I'll quote is a young woman by the name of Jacqueline Jones, who writes about African American women in a book entitled Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow. And she writes about the church stating, "Thus, as a place of peaceful resistance to the white world, the church molded together the tribulations that wives and mothers encountered on the job and at home, and provided a means for these women to triumph over, or at least endure them." So you can see either at the local, the state, or the national level, the church has played a prominent role in African American life. And I think this is equally true in our own community, Frankfort, Franklin County. Whether you're looking at the church as a place where blacks could have leadership roles, an institution that would build self-respect amongst youngsters, a place of equality and worship, or even as a cultural center. I don't know how many people realize it, but the 1880s, when African American High School, the Clinton Street School, was developed and opened, it was the churches that were the leading institution in advocating the funding of the black school system. So the church is the voice of the community. It's a refuge in time of disaster. It provides continuity and identity. And what we want to do today is talk about our religious freedoms that African Americans have experienced through the church. I'm going to talk just a little bit about St. John's AME, First Baptist, the Corinthian Baptist Church, and Grace Methodist Episcopal, a church that used to exist in South Frankfort and is no longer in existence. There's other churches, Bethel Temple and others that were in the community, but I don't really have much information on them, so we won't be covering them today. We'll also be looking at mostly the 19th and early 20th century history of these institutions. Most of my sources come from local secondary works, and anybody who's interested in reading on this subject, there's an excellent book done by Dr. E.E. Underwood entitled A History of the Colored Churches of Frankfort. And it came out in 1906, and a copy of it is available in the library, and I'm sure there's a copy at Kentucky State University. Most of what we'll be seeing today are photographs from the Kentucky Historical Society's collection, from a collection entitled the Wolf, Gretter, and Cusick Collection, which those were photographers who were prominent in Frankfort, took a lot of pictures, and ultimately those photographs were donated to the Historical Society. So these are glass plate, nitrate, and safety film negatives that we've had developed for the show today. Most of the images we have very little information on. We might know the date that they were taken and the names of the individuals in the image, but that's about it. So if you're out there watching at home and you see an individual who's a relative, or you know where and why a particular picture was taken, we'd love to have you call us at the Historical Society, 564-3016, and give us background on that picture, because that's what makes these images even more valuable as artifacts, is the information associated with them. Today, I want to introduce to you John Gray with Historic Frankfort, who has information on a special project that Historic Frankfort will be undertaking in the coming months to further document the history of Frankfort's African-American life. John.
Thanks, Jim. My name is John Gray, and I'm the president of Historic Frankfort, and Historic Frankfort is a local history group, and we're interested in and have received a grant from the Kentucky Heritage Council to do a photographic history of the black experience here in Frankfort and Franklin County. And Jim had mentioned that in the Historical Society collection, they have relatively few images that document the African-American experience here in Frankfort. And beyond that, very little information on a lot of those images. And what we hope to do with this project that we're involved in is, in conjunction with the Kentucky Historical Society, ask you all out in the community to bring us your photographs for copying so that we can supplement the collection at the Kentucky Historical Society. And what we plan to do is this spring have a team of people here in the community that will actually help go through the photographs that you all bring in and actually copy these so that they could be stored for permanent use at the Kentucky Historical Society. And what we would ask you all to do, those of you that do have photographs that you would be willing to share, is bring your photographs in to the different sites that we'll set up here in the next few weeks, and share with us those photographs and help us figure out who the photographs are of, who might have taken them, when they were taken, what the occasion was, so that we can collect all this information also, because what we'd like to end up with is the images and also information on the who, what, where, and how of the images. And what we plan to do with this is not only have these on permanent storage at the Kentucky Historical Society, but also turn them into an exhibit that will be displayed at the Kentucky Historical Society, and also an exhibit that can travel through the local community. So there'll be more information about this in the State Journal in the weeks to come, but I want to thank Jim for giving me this opportunity to say a few words to you about this project before he continues with his program. So,
I think one of the wonderful things about this particular project, John, is that a lot of people, their photographs are very personal treasures, and they're reluctant to loan them, but the good thing about this project, you can take the photos down to your church, and I think there'll be sites at the various African-American churches, and your photos will be copied right there while you wait, and they'll be given back to you, so your originals never really leave your hands. And then after the process is done where all of the images are copied, ultimately I understand that there is going to be an exhibit that comes out of this, possibly a newspaper supplement in the State Journal, a lot of different uses for the materials that will be collected that will get Frankfort's story, the African-American story of Frankfort, out in front of the public where our children and the whole community can enjoy it. And it's really an excellent way to document and preserve the story as well as present it to the public. So Historic Frankfort is to be commended for what it's undertaking. This is an image of Dr. Edward Ellsworth Underwood taken in the year 1918. And Frankfort, Franklin County owes Dr. Underwood a tremendous debt. He led a fascinating life. He came to Kentucky from Ohio, a native of Mount Pleasant, Ohio, the son of an AME minister, Johnson P. and Harriet Underwood, one of the first African Americans to graduate from his local high school, and he eventually went on to get a medical degree from Western Reserve University in 1891. And when he came to Frankfort that same year, there was a tremendous welcoming celebration at the Corinthian Baptist Church, which at that time was the first independent Baptist church. To have a man of his caliber, he was also a licensed minister and a school teacher, as well as a physician, to have him come to our community was an occasion for real celebration. So he came down here and he immediately assumed a position of leadership in the community. He helped form the local NAACP chapter. He was the first African American appointed to the Board of Trustees of Kentucky State University. Eventually, the old Mayo Underwood High School, which used to be down in the bottom, was named in his honor, as well as the Underwood Student Union building there on the campus of Kentucky State University. A man very active in the community and very active in his church. He was a member of the St. John's African Methodist Episcopal Church and served on the steward board and was a superintendent. A man very adept at politics, a leader in the African American wing of the Republican Party, but also a cultured individual. And one of the reasons we even have this presentation today is that Dr. Underwood did a history of all of the African American churches in Frankfort at the turn of the century, and we were going to be drawing on his material that he compiled for today's presentation. Just to show you what kind of man Dr. Underwood was, he had his own medical practice in Frankfort. Here's a shot of the People's Pharmacy in the old American Legion building at the corner of Clinton and Washington Street. And this is roughly around 1912. Here's Dr. Underwood with a few of his medical colleagues who were Frankfort practitioners. And then Dr. Underwood, as I said, was very much a leader. This is a shot taken in the year 1915, and this is a committee, an exposition commission, really, and Dr. Underwood is one of the leaders of the commission. And a man very active in Frankfort and Kentucky state politics. Here we are with Governor Morrow and a bill signing, and there's Dr. Underwood in the back corner there. So we really do have in Dr. Underwood a man who made history as well as preserved it as far as Frankfort's African American community. The first church that we'd like to talk about today is the First Baptist Church. The image that you're looking at was taken in the year 1906, and these women are on the board of deaconesses for the First Baptist Church. And let me tell you a little bit about early religion in Frankfort, and this is pretty much true of all Kentucky. Initially, worship services were interracial. In other words, in early Frankfort, if you were to go to the Baptist church, there were black members of the congregation. As a matter of fact, the First Baptist Church that's now on St. Clair Street was organized in 1816, and as early as 1818, only 2 years later, African Americans were admitted to the congregation. Now that doesn't mean that they worshiped, equally with the whites, in the sense that they had separate services, or if they were in a joint service, the African Americans were restricted to an area of the church, say the gallery section. They had little to no voice in the church organizational matters. As a matter of fact, if they wished to be admitted to the church or to separate from the church, the white members of the congregation had control as far as who was admitted or who was allowed to separate from the church. So it's very much a situation where you might have people of different races using the same building or even worshiping at the same service, but not on equal terms. As an example, there were so many blacks who were coming to the First Baptist Church. By the year 1838, the African Americans petitioned to have their own minister to lead separate services. A man by the name of Henderson Williams was the first pastor for the African Americans, but he had to receive approval from a white committee who more or less checked his credentials. And it wasn't until the black members of the congregation really petitioned in his behalf that he was accepted. So you have people worshiping together but not on equal terms, and it must have been very hard for the African American members of the congregation, because if you're in a service and you're hearing the equality of man preached, and yet to be experiencing discriminatory practices, it was really frustrating and aggravating to the black members of the congregation. So as early as the 1830s, around 1833, you have a number of African Americans seeking to have not only their own minister, but their own facilities and control of their religious worship service. So by 1833, a number of Frankfort's black Baptists organized an autonomous congregation called the Colored Baptist Church. As I mentioned, the first pastor was Henderson Williams, The second pastor was James Monroe, and Frankfort was really blessed to have this man. He came to our community in 1845 and served as the pastor for the Colored Baptist Church for 19 years. He was recognized throughout the state as a leader amongst Kentucky's black Baptists. John G. Fee, the famous white abolitionist, visited Monroe's church in the year 1858, and he would later write of Monroe, he said, "He is a portly, fine-looking man who delivers a very effective service." After Monroe's tenure, he left about 1864, the Reverend Robert Martin came and stayed for 20 years leading the congregation. All told, between the year 1838 and 1906, when Dr. Underwood's book was published, First Baptist had 11 different pastors over that 68-year time span. At the end of that period, when Dr. Underwood published the book, First Baptist had 780 members and over 200 youngsters in the Sunday school. So it was the largest and one of the oldest African American churches in Frankfort. Now, the Board of Deaconess is shot. Let me just tell you, as we go through the pictures, I'll mention the names of the individuals who are in the photographs because there may be a relative or a descendant of that individual in our community. So if you look at this picture here of the deaconesses taken in the year 1906, the women standing, the woman on the left is Miss Betty Beckley, and to her left is Martha Garrett, and seated is Miss Mary Hancock, and next to her is Miss Frances Hawker. Here's another image from the First Baptist Church. This is the choir of the First Baptist Church in the year 1906. And when I did the project on the bottom and worked with the community here, the people I talked to who mentioned their churches always spoke about their choirs. It was a very important thing to have a choir and a good choir and a subject of pride amongst the members of the congregation if you had a choir that was very talented. Now this particular shot, again, was taken for Dr. Underwood's book, and the people standing in the very far back row, if you start on the left-hand side, Verletta Beatty, Susie Berry, and then the gentleman there, the third one in on the top row, is Mr. T.L. Brooks, a very famous contractor, black contractor in Frankfort. Standing to his left is Mary Tall, and then Ben Madison, a prominent trustee and clerk of the First Baptist Church, and then Ms. Mary L. Brooks. Standing right in front of T.L. Brooks is Nanny C. Coleman. The middle row is Julia Morton. Then the gentleman seated there is Mr. Charles H. Smith, and then Virginia Madison. And on the front row, very front row, starting at the left, Bessie Sylvie, Miss E.T. Strauss, Virginia Sylvie, and then the woman seated in the center of the image is Charity Boyd, Willie Sylvie, and Miss Florence Thomas. The Sylvie name is one you heard several times as members of the choir. Well, these are daughters, I believe, of the Reverend Sylvie, who was the pastor of First Baptist in the year 1906, as well as this image taken in the year 1911. He was the 11th pastor, and he was called to First Baptist in the spring of 1905. I don't really know how long his tenure was at First Baptist, but he was very much a dynamic leader of the church. A minister, an African-American minister, had to be a very special individual. He had to possess unusual qualities of character and leadership. He had to be a compelling orator, a fundraiser, a businessman, because the church is very much a business to be run. I also had to serve as the voice of the congregation when dealing with the larger community. Here are a couple shots of the Sylvie family. This is Virginia Sylvie, who I believe was one of his daughters. And then Bessie Sylvie. Earlier you heard me mention the name of Ben Madison. Well, I encountered this image of Mr. Madison in doing the research on North Frankfort, and here he is in a cook's uniform. It wasn't until later when I did this research on the African American churches did I realize how important he was to the First Baptist congregation. He would later be on the board of trustees as well as serve as clerk of the church. Once you start looking at First Baptist, you want to try and research the history of the building of the church facilities. And so I started looking around trying to find where was First Baptist located. And prior to the year 1908 and the construction of the current facilities, First Baptist was in a building, and let me show you. This is an old Sanborn insurance map. And if you look at the lower left corner, there's a building there, a red, it's shaded in red behind a bunch of yellow buildings. And what that is, if you could read the writing on that, it says Bethel Baptist Church, colored. And apparently that was the facility that predated the current First Baptist Church. And it was right in behind Kentucky State Penitentiary on Clinton Street. That's East Clinton Street. If you were to walk farther east on Clinton, you would come to Sullivan's Junkyard, and then you'd come to the Clinton Street School for colored people. So one of the earliest churches, African American church buildings in Frankfort, was this Bethel Baptist Church building behind the old Kentucky State Penitentiary. And if you flip through Dr. Underwood's book, he has a picture of the exterior of that building, a very small little brick building that later would be replaced by the current church at the corner of High and Clinton Streets. Let's take a look at that current church. This is a picture taken in the year 1912. The actual building was erected in 1908. Fascinating story associated with this building, very reflective of sort of the segregationist attitude of the times. What happened was, at the turn of the century, a very dynamic African-American minister by the name of Reverend Robert Mitchell, who was pastoring First Baptist, raised $5,000 to purchase a lot and to build a new church facility to replace the old Bethel church. Well, $5,000 at the turn of the century is roughly the equivalent of $65,000 to $75,000 in today's financial terms. So tremendous amount of effort on the part of the congregation to get that kind of money together. So the church board of trustees goes to the city council and they request a permit to construct this new building at the corner of High and Clinton. Well, the city denies the permit. So the board of trustees, they go to all the adjacent property owners trying to get them to sign a petition to support the construction of the new church. And many of the adjacent property owners who are white refuse to sign the petition. Well, the Reverend Mitchell and the board of trustees decide that they're going to proceed anyway. And so they let a contract with a local individual by the name of Michael Buckley, and they tear down the old buildings on the site and they begin the project. Well, almost immediately the city issues arrest warrants for all of the workmen, the contractor, for the board of trustees of the church, claiming that the church is in violation of the city ordinance. Well, all of these people are hauled in front of the police court judge at that time, W.C. Herndon, and he dismisses the charges because there is no provision for a penalty in the ordinance. The work begins again, and almost immediately the city passes an entire new set of ordinances to fit the circumstances. The contractor, the trustees, all of the laborers are arrested all over again. They're fined, and the church immediately fights back. And that's one of the things that you'll see over and over again, is an African American congregation tenaciously asserting their rights. And that's what First Baptist does. They appeal to the circuit court for an injunction to block the city from harassing and blocking them from stopping the construction efforts on the project. And they do get a temporary injunction. But the story isn't over there. I mean, 2 years have transpired now for this phase of it. April 1903, in a ruling by Judge James B. Cantrell, who ultimately dissolves the injunction, he claims, stating in his ruling, a Negro church is inherently a nuisance per se, and he dissolves the injunction and prohibits the work from continuing on the church. Well, the church officials by now have endured quite a bit. They've been arrested, they've been fined, they've been through several different trials trying to get this matter resolved. But they don't quit. They show tremendous perseverance. They go back to the Court of Appeals, which at that time was the equivalent of Kentucky's Supreme Court, and they request a ruling. In the case of Boyd versus the Board of Councilmen of the City of Frankfort, in February of 1904, Judge Settle issues a permanent injunction blocking the city from stopping the construction of the new church. And basically he says, how can a church not yet erected be a nuisance? And the city's attorneys claim in their suit that the church members of the First Baptist Church sang louder than was agreeable to some of the contiguous residents. And what the judge says, basically to that, he says it's not the volume of their singing, it's race prejudice that is the basis of their objection. So over a 4-year period, the court has endured so much in the way of hardships and hassles and harassment, but ultimately they triumphed, and Dr. Underwood writes in his book, he says that this decision is a victory not only for the church and for the attorneys, but for the race. So they were just elated that they could continue the work on their new church. Here is the architect's rendering of the church, painted in the year 1907, and this is a 1910 photograph of that painting. And the architect was a local individual, Leo Oberwarth. Here's Leo and his wife in the year 1910. As I said, it would be Leo who would design the First Baptist Church, and later his son Julius would go on to design the Riverview Terrace public housing project that's right next to the Capitol Plaza Tower. So the Oberwarth family has done a lot of architectural design work on facilities that have been utilized by African Americans. I'm just going to cycle through these images. As I said earlier in the presentation, sometimes we don't know why they were taken, for what purpose, and who all is in the image. This is a picture entitled The Colored Preachers' Convention, year 1912. Well, we know shortly after the Civil War, African American ministers from all over the state, Baptist ministers, formed a statewide association. By the turn of the century, there were over 350 churches participating with over 57,000 members. And it could be that this is a state-level meeting of that association. It was referred to as the General Association of Colored Baptists, or possibly it could be a district or regional meeting of that group. Here's another shot, a little bit more close up on that. And you can see all of the gentlemen and their wives and children posed in front of the First Baptist Church. Here's another shot, the year 1914, entitled Baptist Church, Colored Convention. And it's interesting to me that in this shot, women are much more prominent in the photo. And I don't know exactly why that is. Again, no one is identified. If anyone knows the story on these photographs, we'd love to know. Here's another shot from the same year, 1914. The only information we have is Baptist Church, Colored Convention. This shot consists of all women, 26 individuals. They're wearing ribbons as if they're in leadership roles, but we just don't know what the story is or even where the picture is taken. Here's another shot entitled Baptist Church, Colored Convention. And again, the same type of thing. 9 women wearing ribbons, unidentified. This shot is a little bit more contemporary. It's a 1926 photograph entitled The Reverend Ballou, Sunday School Class of Women, First Baptist Church. And again, no one is identified. It looks like the women are holding diplomas or graduation certificates. I think the woman in the center there is Miss Alice Samuels, who would later go on to be a principal at the Mayo Underwood School and serve in the Frankfort City school system after the consolidation of the African American and white schools. Why is the young man in the far left corner of the picture in the shot holding a baby? There's a lot of mysteries associated with these pictures, and we'd love for people to contact us and tell us what they know. Here's another shot. This is entitled The Reverend Ballou, the Men's Bible Class, and this is the year 1932. Again, no individual in the photograph is identified, though if you look right at the front row at the center, the white gentleman is Robert Combs, the church sexton, and the man to his immediate left, our right, I believe is the Reverend Ballou. Now this is a wonderful photograph. It's entitled Officers of the First Baptist Church, 1936. And it's a wonderful resource because not only does it show you images of the church leadership in the mid-1930s, but it also identifies activities. Under some of the photographs, you'll see terms like President of the Neighborhood Club, or leader of the Southside Missionary Circle. So are these entities still in existence? What role did they play, or what role do they still play? The pastor at that particular time in the mid-30s was J. Welby Broadus. And of course, the current pastor of the First Baptist Church there at the corner of High and Clinton is the Reverend Moore. Now this is a wonderful shot from the 1940s, the war years. It was taken in 1941, obviously on the steps there of the Capitol building. It's entitled The First Baptist Church Colored Vacation Bible Class. And if you'll look at the photo, there's a number of black and white Baptists gathered together, and I just wonder if the two congregations, the First Baptist that's located on St. Clair and then the First Baptist at the corner of High and Clinton, weren't collaborating when it came to Vacation Bible School. But again, we don't really know much of the circumstances about the photo. And that is the most contemporary photo that we have as far as the First Baptist congregation goes. So we're very hopeful that people will participate in John Gray and Historic Frankfort's project, and will bring in photos from the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s of the community and the church, so we can bring the story up to a more recent time. Let's switch congregations and talk a little bit about the St. John's African Methodist Episcopal Church. This is a picture of the St. John's AME Board of Trustees. The photo appeared in the Underwood publication, and it was taken in the year 1906. Standing on the left is Mr. B.T. Harvey, and standing adjacent to him is Mr. M.J. Trumbo, and seated on the left is John Ecton, and then Mr. D.E. Reed. And I have been told that Mr. Ecton was a prominent contractor here in the community and did some construction work on the American Legion building that used to be at the corner of Clinton and Washington Street. Now, I'm unsure how accurate that is, but of all the four individuals, that's the most we know about anyone who is in that particular picture. The St. John's AME congregation is amongst the oldest in the city, dating to 1839. That very same year that it was organized in 1839, it had its own building, which was very rare for a congregation to immediately have its own church. Oftentimes, black congregations from different denominations would band together and perhaps share a facility if they weren't sharing a facility with a white congregation. So in 1839, when the church is organized, they immediately have their own facility, courtesy of a woman, a benefactress by the name of Miss Triplett, who donated a lot and the building on the lot to her two servants, and they in turn utilized it for the St. John's AME congregation. The congregation got off to a strong start. It had had numerous pastors. Between the year of its organization in 1839 and 1906, it had 39 different pastors. The membership was strong, very active, growing church. In the year 1906, they have over 240 individual members. Many of the most prominent families, African American families in Frankfort, were members of the St. John's AME congregation. Amongst the prominent leaders who pastored the church was the Reverend B.F. Lee, who would later go on to be president of Wilberforce University, and the Reverend D.S. Bentley, who came to the congregation in the 1880s and during that time period helped the group adopt its current name, the St. John's AME. The Reverend J.M. Turner, who purchased the present site of the church structure, which was built in the year 1893. At the time that Dr. Underwood's book was published in 1906, the Reverend J.M. Holt was leading the church. He was a native of Tennessee who had been called to the congregation. Again, here's another shot of Mr. B.T. Harvey. And what I did, I went through the collection of the Kentucky Historical Society, and if I recognized names that were associated with the church, I would pull that image and have a copy of it made. Now, I don't know what role Mr. Harvey played in our community, but he was a very distinguished gentleman, and there were a lot of photos of him. Now, here's a shot, and you might say to yourself, well, this looks like it's torn or it's been damaged. Well, what happened was a lot of these photographs are on glass plates, and they're coated with a chemical emulsion. And over the years, the emulsion has peeled or flaked and damaged the image. But this is an image of the Board of Stewardesses, of the St. John's AME congregation in the year 1906. And women play a very active leadership role in African American churches. The stewardesses had very important functions within the church, leadership roles that were both financial, in relation to the Sunday schools and the various work groups, that type of thing. The women that are pictured here, two of the images, two of the women's faces are obscured. The emulsion has peeled off. I'll just give you those names. Mrs. Rebecca Harris and Miss Polly Smith. And the two women that you see standing in the back row are Kitty Halleck and Sally Handy. And then seated in the front row, the woman on the far left, is the pastor's wife, Mrs. J.M. Holt. And then next to her, Daphne Mead, then Susan Butcher, and then Amanda Rhodes. Here's the St. John's AME choir in the year 1906. And you can see Dr. Underwood is seated there on the left-hand side of the group. In the back row, standing from left to right, Mrs. Luzemia Thomas, Allie Williams, the Reverend A.R. Ward, Mattie Childs, Mary Alexander, and Lena Carter. Then the middle row is Cordia Trumbo, Miss Willie Thomas, Mr. George Williams, who was the president of the choir, and on the front row is Miss Willie Hardy, Dr. Underwood, Miss B.F. Gray, and Miss Abby Holt. Now this is a beautiful photograph taken in the year 1935, and it's the interior of the sanctuary of St. John's AME Church. If you haven't had the opportunity to visit St. John's, you really ought to poke your head in the sanctuary. It's gorgeous. It's got a wonderful motif. You can't really see it in this slide, but around the walls on either side is decorative plasterwork that's been painted. And then at the front of the sanctuary, there are beautiful murals. I mean, it's just a gorgeous church. My suspicion is that this is taken in the springtime, perhaps Easter Sunday, due to the large number of white hats. That's my only clue. I think that it's a holiday Sunday. And here's another lovely photo from the Historical Society's collection. It's entitled the AME, which stands for African Methodist Episcopal Youth Council and Leadership Training Institute of Frankfort, April 6, 1942. And this looks to be on the campus of Kentucky State University. My guess, given the number of individuals in the shot, that this is probably a statewide leadership training institute, and we've got young members of the congregation, local congregation, as well as from congregations all over Kentucky. And the young lady on the front row in the very center has looks to be a crown on. She may be the queen of the council. But other than that, we don't know exactly anything about this particular image or why this group was meeting for what purpose. I mentioned some of the prominent families associated with St. John's AME. One of the more noted families in Frankfort for many, many years was the Robb family. T.K. Robb, Thomas K. Robb, ran a livery hall and funeral house in Frankfort on Clinton Street, Clinton and St. Clair. And these are some of his children here. The little boy on the far right is Jack Robb, a noted entertainer and civic and social leader in Frankfort for many years. Here's a picture of Jack. Jack would play a very prominent role during the urban renewal process, helping African American families relocate out of the bottom and find replacement housing in other communities within Frankfort, Franklin County. Of course, people are acquainted with the Reverend Mayhem, who is currently pastoring St. John's AME Church, and he graciously provided us access to this image of Jack Robb. One of the other prominent congregations in our community is the First Corinthian Baptist Church. Here's a shot of the officers and trustees of Corinthian Baptist Sunday School, taken in the year 1906. Starting on the far left, standing, the woman whose face is partially obscured is Nettie McKee, then Miss Sadie S. Fishback, who was the wife of the minister, the Reverend E.T. Fishback, who's seated right in front of her, then Sadie M. Kibbe and Grace Jones. Of course, the Reverend Fishback And then a very special person seated beside him, Miss Winnie A. Scott. And for many, many years, Miss Scott was a teacher at the Clinton Street School for Colored People. And the Winnie A. Scott Memorial Hospital, of course, was named in her honor. It was located on East 2nd Street. But she was very much a dynamic leader in her church, the school, and the community. And then the partially obscured image of Miss Lizzie Ellis to Miss Scott's left. The origins of the First Corinthian church are somewhat of a mystery. There's different theories as to how this congregation came into being. We know when it was first formed, it was referred to as the First Independent Baptist Church. And Dr. Underwood writes in his history that the group organized in the late summer of 1876. A small group, 7 individuals, separated themselves from the colored First Baptist Church and set up their own congregation, which was recognized by the St. Clair Street First Baptist Church in July of 1876 as an independent body with the right to organize. And see, what you may not understand is that when these African American groups were setting up their congregations, they would go back to the white church that they were originally associated with and request permission to establish a separate congregation. So when First Baptist set up a congregation, it received permission from the St. Clair Street First Baptist. And when this group organized, it went back to the mother church and received the authority to establish a separate congregation. So what Dr. Underwood really is saying is there was a schism in the First Baptist Church, some type of disagreement. We don't know what caused it, but a small group separates from the black First Baptist Church and organizes its own congregation. And it won't be until the mid-1880s, roughly 10 years later, that the two congregations are on relatively good terms again. Apparently whatever separated them was serious enough that it did cause problems between the two congregations. But there's a whole other theory to how this all happened, and I think it's a theory that deserves some attention. Charlie Hines, who's a prominent historian in his own right and a resident of Frankfort, did a history of the First Baptist Church there on St. Clinton Street entitled 175 Years of Heritage, 1816 to 1991. And he has a whole different perspective and interpretation about how the Corinthian Baptist group became a separate congregation. He says, it's the year 1866. Large numbers of African Americans are moving into Frankfort after the Civil War. Many of them are not joining the colored First Baptist Church. They're joining the First Baptist Church on St. Clair Street and participating with the white congregation. So many African Americans join that there's almost 600 African Americans participating in the services there shortly after the Civil War. So many so that the white leadership in the congregation actually petitions the African Americans to consider separating and forming their own church. And they do so in the year 1867. Well, that's almost 10 years before what Dr. Underwood asserts is the organizational date of the Corinthian group. So Charlie's saying 10 years prior to Dr. Underwood's estimated timetable, the blacks are being petitioned by the whites in the First Baptist to branch out on their own and form their own congregation, which they do so in the summer of 1867. The new group initially meets in a facility on East Clinton Street at the rear of the penitentiary. So I assume that's the old Bethel Baptist Church, which would have still been in use by the other group of black Baptists referred to as the Colored Baptist Church. Could these newcomers have left First Baptist and initially worshiped with the other group of black Baptists and then separated? In other words, could both Charlie Hines and Dr. Underwood be right? It's possible that they are, and I think further research may confirm that. But what Charlie goes on to say is shortly after they start meeting in this little Bethel church that we talked about behind the penitentiary, they separate and they have access to an old Freedmen's Bureau building. The Freedmen Bureau came into Kentucky following the Civil War and set up a program to help educate blacks, to help blacks establish themselves after the Civil War, give them the educational tools necessary to learn, earn a living. And so Charlie says that the Freedmen's Bureau provides access to their building, which was located on Miro Street between St. Clair and Washington. As a matter of fact, he goes on to say only a year later, after 1867, the next year, 1868, the African Americans actually buy the building for $1, and that becomes their permanent home. One thing is certain, that after this 1867 time period, African Americans are really no longer welcome to worship with the white congregation there on St. Clair Street. And I think that's typical of most of the white churches following the Civil War, whether you're talking about Franklin County or Kentucky or even the South. The congregations rapidly segregate and set up their own religious institutions following the Civil War. The new church flourishes. It has strong leadership. Some of the most noted African Americans, preachers in Kentucky, will pastor the Corinthian Baptist Church. James H. Parrish of Louisville pastors the church in the mid-1870s. Then the Reverend R. H. C. Mitchell, who reestablishes harmony between the First Baptist and the Corinthian group, even helps them get a new building erected in the late 1880s. 1887, a new facility is erected on the lot where the Freedmen's Bureau building is. The Reverend William A. Credit, who was touted as being an eloquent speaker, had a tremendous charisma and ability to raise funds. It's not until the year 1893 that the church changes its name from the First Independent Baptist Church to the First Corinthian Baptist. According to Dr. Underwood, they selected the name because they felt it was more harmonious with the Christian missionary spirit. By the year 1898, almost the turn of the century, the Reverend Elijah T. Fishback becomes the pastor of the congregation, a young African American from Nebo, Kentucky, and a graduate of State University of Louisville, and very much a leader in the community. The membership of the church at that time stands at over 168 individuals, and it had a number of prominent African American leaders in the congregation. Professor William H. Mayo, who was the principal at Clinton Street School for many years as a member of the congregation, as well as a number of other noted African American leaders. Here's a picture of the Corinthian Baptist Church taken in the 1960s, early 1960s, right at the, I guess, the mid part of the urban renewal process. We're on Miro Street. We're looking at the front facade of the Corinthian Church. And this is an image that's held in a private collection that a gentleman was just nice enough to let me copy. So when we talk about John Gray's project with Historic Frankfort, we know that there are pictures out there in the community. And thanks to John and the African American Heritage Commission, which funded John's project, we can possibly have access to these kind of images. This image is not a part of the Kentucky Historical Society's collection. So if you have photos in your own private hands that tell the story of African Americans in Frankfort, we'd really like you to consider sharing them, like this individual generously did with myself when I was doing my research on the bottom. And we know that even though this church that you're seeing here was torn down during the urban renewal process, the congregation rebuilds their church in South Frankfort at the corner of 2nd and Murray Street. This is a very dim copy. It's sort of hard to see. It's a State Journal article that appeared in July of 1966. And here's the Reverend Charles N. King with the Board of Trustees, and they're doing the groundbreaking for the new sanctuary and auditorium and the rebirth of their church. That's one of the things that's impressed me, is that African American congregations are very tenacious, they persevere, and this congregation easily might have gone out of existence with the loss of its facility, but it didn't. They had to raise over $75,000, and they did, and they rebuilt their church, and it still stands today. As a matter of fact, if you went over there, the Reverend Newby is currently the pastor of the First Corinthian Baptist Church. This is an extremely rare image of a church that no longer exists. At one time in our history here in Frankfort, there was an African American church in South Frankfort. And the name of the church was the Grace Methodist Episcopal Church. It was organized in 1880. It was the newest, I guess most recent and smallest of all the churches. By the year 1906, when Dr. Underwood's book is published, it still only has 30 members, a very active church, and the only one to my knowledge that had a facility in South Frankfort during this time period. We know that it was located somewhere on East 3rd Street between Murray and Fowler Streets, and in the 26 years that Dr. Underwood documents in his book, it had 18 different pastors. We know the church burned and was rebuilt. We know it had a very active Sunday school program, but I'm not really sure why this congregation is still not in existence today. I found it listed in city directories for as late as the 1930s, but when you get into the latter years, like the 1950s, you don't find mention of it again. So that's a mystery in and of itself that we'd like to find out what happened to the Grace Methodist Episcopal Church. Now I'm going to briefly just go through some slides real quick. They're not really related to the church, but they're interesting images of African American life in Frankfort. And if anybody has any information, please call the Historical Society. This is an image entitled The Frankfort Colored Nursery School. This is taken in the year 1937. I think that the colored nursery was sponsored by a church, maybe First Baptist, or by a group of churches. We don't know where the nursery school was located. The adult standing at the far left of the picture is Odessa Hayes, and assisting her was a woman by the name of Dorothy Wilson, who's not in this photograph. The children, the little girl with the rope who's standing in front of Miss Hayes, was Mary Christian Kennedy, and the boy with the blocks there in the very center of the photo was Richard Williams, the son of Alice King. And the little girl who's on the telephone on the far left is Jerry Robinson, who is the great niece of Alice King. Here's another picture of the colored nursery taken in the same year, 1937. And there's the children. It must be the noon meal, and they're having a short prayer. No one is identified, and we really are not sure of the circumstances of the photograph. And here's the last in this series on the colored nursery, nap time at the colored nursery. We don't know the name of the woman who's standing in the back. This is a wonderful image entitled Jackson Robb Banquet, the year 1947. And an individual here in the community told me what this actually is a photo of a group, a social group called the Grad Club. The Grad Club was organized in the early 1930s as a support group for the Mayo Underwood School, because at that period in time, often the books, the equipment, the supplies that the African American school systems would receive would be hand-me-downs from the white school system. While the Grad Club existed to raise money to buy athletic equipment, to underwrite social activities for the school children, basically to support the school, the Mayo Underwood High School. And this was a banquet. Someone told me that this was an annual kind of thing that the Grad Club would put on. And there, standing at the back of the table, is Jackson Robb, along with his escort. We know one of the things that took place during the 30s and 40s, there would be wonderful charity events held at the Mayo Underwood High School auditorium as fundraisers. This is a broadside promoting a fashion review that was going to be a benefit, raise funds, be a benefit for the Winnie A. Scott Memorial Hospital, sponsored by Jackson K. Robb. And here's a picture of the old Mayo Underwood High School taken in the year 1930, which was sort of the site for a lot of these activities. Well, during the research for this program, I encountered a series of 3 images entitled Jackson K. Robb Play. And I remember from talking to people in the community that there were a series of plays and theatrical productions that were sponsored and held at the school. Well, let me just show you. Here is a stage setting and black actors and actresses. We know that the year is 1935. No one is identified. We know the location is more than likely Mayo Underwood High School. Don't know the name of the play or really anything about it. Look how elaborate these settings are, these stages. I mean, people were putting really a lot of effort into this. It must have been a very popular activity for the community and allowed young African Americans an opportunity to express themselves and to have some experience with theater and drama. Here's the last image. And again, this does sort of look like a high school stage setting. All of these images were taken in the year 1935. And then a few mystery slides that I thought people in the community might enjoy and might know something about. In our collection at the Historical Society, we have many portraits of both African Americans and whites in the Frankfort area, and oftentimes we only know the name and the date that the picture was made. This is Miss Bessie Cook. The year is 1909. Mr. J.A. Vinnie, the year 1907, and I had that image copied because it looks like Mr. Vinnie is holding the scriptures in his hands. He might have been a minister or a lay person working in behalf of the church in our community. Here's an image entitled P.W.L. Jones Convention, 1914. And this is a picture of a woman entitled Frances Madison, the year 1911. Cordelia Madison, the year 1905. And the reason that I included this, notice that she's wearing a mortarboard and she's got an armband on her left arm. And you can just barely make out the initials, C.S.H. And I'll bet you that stands for Clinton Street High School. And so she was probably graduating from Clinton Street in the year 1905. This image, taken in the year 1934, is entitled Howard Gershom, Group of 7 Black Men. And what attracted me to it, since we were working on a presentation on the African American churches, there at the headstone there, or the cornerstone off to the left, you can see the year 1930, and inscribed next to that is dedicated to the worship of God through service to man. And all the individuals appear to be wearing uniforms. I don't know if they were members of the same business or company, or exactly why their image was made, nor do we know the names of any of the people in the photograph. Few last slides. The Reverend E.J. Jackson, the year 1911. And I don't really know what church that the Reverend Jackson was pastoring at that particular time. Here's a shot of his family. And then apparently his daughter was a graduate. You can see the KNII initials on her mortarboard. That stands for Kentucky Normal and Industrial Institute for Colored People, which was the name of what eventually became Kentucky State College and then Kentucky State University. So today we've looked at a wide range of images. We've talked about the role of the African American church, the critical role that the church plays and still does play. And I'm hoping that those of you who've tuned into the show and enjoyed it might be willing to share their images with Mr. Gray and Historic Frankfort when they, this spring, begin collecting and copying photographs to tell in a more thorough and more professional fashion the story of Kentucky and Frankfort's African American life in our city, capital city in Franklin County. Thank you very much.